During World War I, the senior members of the British royal family kept awfully busy. One of them shattered his pelvis when a near 1,000-pound horse decided to ride him instead of the other way around. Another one enjoyed some time in the trenches and examining early tanks. His brother came under fire from German warships, and their sister distributed nicotine and acid tablets to soldiers and sailors in gift boxes. And if you want to learn more about their adventures and misadventures, including whether or not they should be held responsible for the execution of the royal family, as suggested by a certain Netflix crowning achievement of streaming entertainment, well, take a look at our video here on YouTube, What Did the British Royals Get Up To During World War I? Among other things, that video also includes a great The Road Not Taken tie-in and why almost everyone universally gets that poem's meaning quite incorrect in rather ironic ways, as well as how the man it was written about also initially misinterpreted Frost's intent, which was mostly just to tease him, and how that all partially helped lead to that man's death in World War I as a result. But that was World War I. What about the story of the world's most famous royals during World War II? Well, in what follows, we will discover how a sailor prince saved his entire crew from almost certain death via a rather spur-of-the-moment scheme, which monarch would be best suited to fix your carburetor, how many secret plans a king can set in motion without his nation finding out, whether the former King of England, as is often stated, really tried to buddy up to Hitler to help get his throne back after being forced to abdicate a few years earlier, and why his other brother is at the center of a similar major conspiracy theory involving no less than Winston Churchill himself ordering his death. So strap on your royal cape, grab your shrubbery and holy hand grenades, and let's dive into what the British royals got up to during World War II. Just before we get back to discussing what the British royals actually got up to during World War II, do you have feet and wobbly bits? Well, today's sponsor, Bombas, has got you covered, literally. Bombas is a company that was founded over a decade ago when its creators learned that the top 3 items homeless shelters request in donations are socks, underwear, and t-shirts. Not coincidentally, they set out to try to make the world's most comfy socks, underwear, and t-shirts, and from the start set a policy that with every single purchase, they donate one such item to homeless shelters and other such organizations, to date over 150 million items. As to what makes their products so comfortable, they make them from high-end materials like merino wool and extra long staple cotton, and carefully design things from maximally good skin feel, from underwear that will make you feel like you're going commando, which I think we can all agree no pants is the best pants. I may or may not be wearing any pants right now. You don't know. To, for example, their socks have no seams by the toes and super good arch support. Also of note, Bombas offers 100% happiness guarantee, free returns and exchanges for any reason. And when we queried them about for real any reason, they even noted if your mobster brother-in-law makes one of your socks swim with the fishes, they've got you covered with a replacement, shipping to over 200 countries worldwide. Your move, Frankie Figs. In the end, feel good and do good with Bombas, knowing your purchase is doing some real good in the world. New customers also get 20% off your first purchase. Just go to bombas.com/TIFO and use the code TIFO at checkout. To begin with, on January the 20th, 1936, King George V, who had helped guide Britain through the Great War, died from complications of a respiratory illness. And by complications, we mean an injection of morphine and cocaine administered by his personal physician, Lord Dawson of Penn, because the past was the worst. Or kind of the best, depending on how you look at it. I mean, only a couple decades before this, if you had a cough, you could simply pick up some heroin supplied to your local market by its inventor, Bayer, and call it good. Granted, the long-term ramifications of everybody knocking back heroin anytime they felt a little off soon became clear, and Bayer thus quickly backtracked on their new revolutionary advertised as non-addictive cure-all, and instead chose to switch to pushing their other relatively new product in aspirin instead, probably for the best, although ironically also probably helped kill millions of people given the Spanish flu pandemic that killed about 50 to 100 million people in just 2 years, and how aspirin was not exactly ideal for that, but passed out like candy at the time. And we are back to the past being the worst. But quoting from the king's doctor's diary on how he euthanized the monarch, hours of waiting just for the mechanical end when all that is really life has departed only exhausts the onlookers and keeps them so strained that they cannot avail themselves of the solace of thought, communion, or prayer. I therefore decided to determine the end and injected myself 3/4 grains of morphine and shortly afterwards 1 grain of cocaine into the distended jugular vein. Rollin Ramsay, writing for the British Medical Journal, would further speculate, The reason for Dawson's action was to ensure that the announcement of the king's death should appear first in the morning edition of the Times and not in some lesser publication later in the day. In Ramsay's view, this was less of a case of euthanasia, but rather a, to quote, convenience killing. Either way, after the king was the recipient of a mercy killing, it was time for a succession, and the crown went to George's firstborn son, the Prince of Wales, known to his family and friends as simply David. However, David was, shall we say, not considered by his father ideal for the role of king, in no small part because of the countless mistresses and affairs he had with various married women, let alone his complete disdain for royal pageantry or really keeping up royal appearances or traditions at all. King George would write of this, "After I am dead, the boy will ruin himself in 12 months. And further, I pray to God that my eldest son will never marry and have children, and that nothing will come between Bertie and Lilibet on the throne." Ironically, he'd eventually get his wish precisely because David finally found a woman he wanted to put a ring on. More on this in a bit. But for now, pertinent to our story today, a couple years before the king's death, Hitler tried to strengthen ties between Germany and Britain via attempting to arrange a marriage between the then 40-year-old David and a 17-year-old girl by the name of Frederica of Hanover. So why and how did Hitler think that this would work? Well, Frederica was the daughter of Duke Ernest August of Brunswick, though he had had to give up his various British titles owing to have served in the German army during World War I, and likewise ended up having to give up his German titles as well after the German Revolution of 1918 and 1919. It wasn't all bad for the former royal, however. He simply took to living in and managing his various estates after, most notably residing in a couple of his castles in Austria and Germany. While his exact relations to a large percentage of the royals is an aside too far, suffice it to say the family were an extremely prominent bloodline, including Ernest being a first cousin to King George V himself and cousin to German Emperor Wilhelm II, and oh by the way, his wife was Princess Victoria Louise, daughter of his cousin, Emperor Wilhelm II, because incest is the best apparently, at least if you're a royal, or from Alabama. Thus, Hitler felt marrying the future British monarch to that bloodline was a smashing idea to help bring the two nations together, especially as not only had Frederica been raised in Austria and Germany, but she'd even been a member of the Hitler Youth, though not exactly voluntarily on her family's part, turns out, though Hitler was likely unaware of this latter fact. Frederica would later write of this, "One day, two women in uniform appeared in my parents' room, and my parents told me to come out. It had become a law that all children had to register with the Nazi youth movement, and the women had come to remind my parents of this duty. My father didn't like the Nazi movement, but he couldn't discuss it openly. After 2 weeks in the youth movement, I had a long private talk with my father. He explained to me what the whole uniform thing really meant, and we decided together that it would be better for me to cut all ties with it, but since I was in Germany, that would have been impossible under the law, so I was sent to England." She remained there for a couple years before moving to Italy to live with Princess Helena of Greece, where she'd meet her future husband, Prince Paul, marrying him in 1938 and ultimately becoming Queen of Greece, and later the Queen Mother when her son became king in 1964, remaining so for about a decade until the monarchy was removed from power. But going back to Hitler's attempt to arrange a marriage with her and the future King of England, Frederica's parents refused to try such an engagement, primarily owing to the fact that David was 23 years her senior. As an aside on that one, ironically, Frederica's mother, Victoria Louise, herself had once been a strong candidate to marry David. Awkward. The age difference did not seem to bother Hitler, however, which is no surprise given his very vocal preference for very young women, due to the fact that, as he would put it, a girl of 18 to 20 is as malleable as wax. It should be possible for a man, whoever the chosen woman may be, to stamp his own imprint on her. That's all the woman asks for. See our video, Hitler's Many Women and Their Often Unfortunate Ends, for more equally disturbing insights into Hitler's rather robust and little talked about love life. But in any event, settle down David would not during his father's lifetime, and most embarrassingly of all for the family, he continued to seemingly have no issue with sleeping with various married women, some quite prominent. He even at one point had a rather passionate love affair with former French prostitute Marguerite Alibert before she killed her husband. Naturally, there was a scramble and very concerted effort to cover up the princely connection in the subsequent trial, where she was defended by one of the top British lawyers of the era, Sir Edward Marshall Hall, who literally had the nickname the Great Defender. Despite it being clear she had murdered her husband, Alibert was acquitted via variously lamenting her, to quote, Oriental husband and his, again to quote, Eastern depravities that drove her to shoot him several times in the head. In any event, upon the king's death, David nonetheless became King Edward VIII, but after a whole lot of political wrangling, abdicated on December 10th, 1936, ruling for just 327 days, ironically just coming in under the wire of his father's prediction that he'd ruin himself within 12 months of becoming king. Although, seemingly, David had a very different perspective on this. You see, the reason he abdicated was out of love for a woman, American Wallis Simpson, who, while the British government possibly could have been coerced to accept her American nationality, and indeed, Americans were seemingly in high support of the Union at the time, so might have been a good way to strengthen ties between the nations, they could not abide the fact that she had previously been divorced and was in the process of divorcing her second husband so she could marry the king. Beyond the obvious PR problems here, the Church of England and British law rejected her first divorce as being valid, given it was on the grounds of an emotional separation, not an affair by her partner. Further, the Church of England also forbade any remarriage of someone who was divorced if their former spouse was still alive. This was a rather ironic stance given how the Church of England came to be, as we think of it, when the Pope refused to annul King Henry VIII's marriage so he could find a new wife. Easy fix, just oust the Pope and the Catholics and make King Henry the head of the Church of England, and divorce eventually granted, no problem. Nevertheless, about 4 centuries later, the Church of England's stance was, to quote, "In no circumstances can Christian men or women remarry during the lifetime of a wife or a husband." When King Edward refused to back down on his determination to marry Mrs. Simpson, a few compromises were proposed, such as allowing him to marry, but have his wife not be officially titled as queen. And it even, for a time, appeared as if the majority of working-class individuals were in support of the union if the king wanted it. But alas, the elite were not having it, and indeed, many were not overly fond of King Edward anyway, with one even going so far as to say the best thing that could happen for the country was for the king to fall and break his neck. In a last-ditch effort, the king attempted to give a speech to the people to try to convince them, as well as assure them that he would see to it that she would not officially be queen, with his proposed speech including, "Neither Mrs. Simpson nor I have ever sought to insist that she should be queen. All that we desired was that our married happiness should carry with it a proper title and dignity for her, befitting my wife. Now that I have at last been able to take you into my confidence, I feel it best to go away for a while so that you may reflect calmly and quietly, but without undue delay, on what I have said." Unfortunately for him, but perhaps very fortunate for history for reasons we'll soon get into, his giving such a speech was likewise blocked by the government, who threatened to all resign if he should go through with his matrimony plans. Thus, in the end, his choice was to break off his relationship with Simpson or give up his crown so he could do what he wanted. He chose the latter, which is kind of sweet if you really think about it. That said, many then and since have speculated his future wife only had such a hold on him due to her alleged sexual depravities, with some contemporaries even going further that she had fixed some sexual issue the king allegedly had, and in all resulting in her having almost total control of him because sure, why not? However, given he seems to have been shampooing Wookiees all over the world before this, and that being king would have seemingly only helped him on that front, it seems weird that if that was his motivation, he'd bother to give up the crown just to put a ring on this one woman. I mean, he seemingly could also have just continued sleeping with her and not married her, and all good to remain king. Needless to say, such speculations and many others you'll read when you dive into their stories seem more designed to have made her look like a gold-digging succubus, which the British media absolutely did at every opportunity at the time, rather than more reasonably just a couple humans who were madly in love and wanted to get hitched no matter what anyone else thought or what it cost them. Maybe a bit illogical and less than practical, but you know, who among us hasn't done stupid things in such a love-struck state? But going back to his abdication, in his announcement, he stated, "I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love." From then on, he would become more or less an exile from Britain, sent to France, and otherwise an outcast with the royals and his former peers, and under threat that if he ever returned to England without a specific invitation, he'd be cut off financially. It was likewise strongly requested that he and his wife they all hated keep a low and rather anonymous profile so as to not further embarrass the monarchy and the nation, to the point that his formerly close relationship with his mother became so embittered he would write in 1939, "Your last letter destroyed the last vestige of feeling I had left for you, and has made further normal correspondence between us impossible." Likewise, when he'd first agreed to the abdication and new title of Duke of Windsor and His Royal Highness, he had assumed similar honorifics would be afforded his wife, but after his marriage, while she did become the Duchess of Windsor, his brother the King explicitly legally denied her the honorific Her Royal Highness, apparently pissing the Duke off quite royally. Speaking of the new king, the next in line to the throne was David's younger brother Albert, or Bertie, who took the royal name of George VI, perhaps today most prominently remembered in some regions thanks to the 2010 film The King's Speech. We'll dive more into the Duke and Duchess's extremely controversial story and Hitler's plan to restore his throne if Germany had managed to conquer Britain in a bit. But going back to the main theme here of what the royals got up to during the war and the start of this conflict in Europe, in September of 1939, the royal family thus included King George VI, his wife Queen Elizabeth, and their daughters, also Elizabeth, known as Lilibet and Margaret, or Margot. Also, due to their tales being rather interesting in this one, we'll additionally be covering the wartime service of a fantastic foursome of dukes, the aforementioned allegedly traitorous Duke of Windsor and his wife, the king's younger brothers, the Duke of Gloucester and the Duke of Kent, and the man later known as the Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Philip of Mountbatten. So going back to King George VI, by the end of 1939, 75% of British homes owned a radio set, meaning that George VI could speak directly to most of his subjects all at once, which he did, albeit very reluctantly. The king famously was a bit of an introvert and suffered from a speech impediment since childhood, a stammer allegedly caused by several physical and psychological factors generally, whether accurately or not, attributed to things like the use of splints for his legs, being forced to write with the right hand despite being left-handed, abuse at the hands of his nanny, and harsh criticism from his father. Even before his accession, the future king sought the services of Australian speech therapist Lionel Logue to help rectify the issue, a relationship which deserves an episode of its own to clear up the reality versus Hollywoodizing in the otherwise excellent film The King's Speech. But for now, suffice it to say, thanks to Logue, the king was able to partially overcome his impediment, and on September the 3rd, 1939, he spoke on the radio announcing Britain's entry into the war. In this and subsequent speeches, George always stressed the importance of courage, which he defined as the schoolboy's definition of courage, that part of you which says, stick it, while the rest of you says, chuck it. During the war, the king would also travel frequently to barracks, factories, hospitals, and even to theaters of operations to speak directly to soldiers, workers, and military personnel. His first tour abroad took place in December of 1939 when he visited the British Expeditionary Force in France. According to his biographer, Sir John Wheeler Bennett, and yes, for once I did not misspeak, there are actually two Wheelers in his name, the king always offered words of encouragement and interest, and wherever possible, a note of humor. In July of 1940, the Battle of Britain broke out, an existential duel between the RAF and the Axis Air Forces. King George and Queen Elizabeth traveled up and down the country visiting RAF airstrips, Home Guard barracks, and plane factories. The Ministry of Supply noted the effects of these factory visits and found that they had a notably positive effect on boosting production figures. During all this, the Luftwaffe resorted to bombing factories and civilian targets, and subsequently the royal family were advised to move away from Buckingham Palace, which George and Elizabeth refused to do. A compromise was eventually reached so that the royal couple would reside in Buckingham Palace during the day, but spend the nights no doubt roughing it in Windsor Castle. It's good to be the king. As the German bombs first ravaged London's East End, the king and queen promptly showed up to express their sympathy to targeted residents. They would continue to do so during the Blitz and even later in the war when the V-1 missiles first fell on Britain. Eventually, however, the government asked the royals not to show up at bombing sites, not so much because of potential danger, but because their visits were reported widely in the press, thus giving German intelligence precise details about where the bombs had fallen and how much damage they had caused. Moving on from there, on September the 8th, 1940, a bomb fell over Buckingham Palace, luckily with no serious consequences. 5 days later, more bombs were dropped over the royal residence, causing only minor damage. According to historian Edward Shawcross, the first attack had been accidental, but the second air raid was intentionally aimed at the royal family. The royal couple felt that this near-death experience brought them closer to their people. Georgie Boy wrote, "We have both found a new bond with them, as Buckingham Palace has been bombed as well as their homes, and nobody is immune from it." Although, one might argue having a 3-bedroom home containing your family bombed versus a 775-room palace isn't quite on the same level of risk to a given occupant somewhere in the home, but the sentiment was appreciated, I'm sure. And I mean, their yard outside their palace was damaged and everything, so they were probably crapping themselves in one of their 78 bathrooms, just thinking about having to have one of their servants call a landscaper to fix the lawn. But after the event, the Queen felt that she could now look the East End in the face. And all silliness aside, this was meant as a direct attack on the monarchs, so they were genuinely in the crosshairs here in a way most were not. On that note, in spite of their stiff upper-lipped attitude, the royals had some serious concerns about their safety, especially in case of a German invasion. The king even installed a shooting range in Buckingham Palace for him and Queen Elizabeth to practice their gun skills so they could go all John McClane on any invading soldiers. In fact, according to a palace visitor who remained unnamed, George intended to lead a resistance movement if the German army marched over London. Although, such rumors aside, in reality, George and co. had drafted a secret plan to spirit his family to safety in case of a German invasion or a kidnapping attempt, dubbed the Coates Mission. The gist of the plan was to assemble an elite military force who, in case of serious threat, would escort King George, Queen Elizabeth, and the 2 princesses to a safe house in the Midlands or Northern England. This force was built around a core company from the legendary Coldstream Guards, the oldest regiment in the British Army. It would also include troops from the 2nd Northamptonshire Yeomanry, the 12th Royal Lancers, the Royal Army Service Corps, and a military police company. The command of this elite unit was entrusted to Major James Coates, hence the name of the mission, which it turns out was not just to remind them to bring a jacket if they had to leave the palace so they wouldn't catch their death of pneumonia. In case of an Axis invasion of southern England, the men of the Coates mission would split into 2 units. One would look after the monarchs and the other would protect the princesses. It was crucial that the royal couple and their daughters would be kept separate to prevent the entire family from falling into enemy hands, and also we are just speculating here because traveling with kids, even in the best of times, can be a major pain. No, we can't stop for food, the Germans are literally chasing us. We'll get there when we get there, okay? Just best to leave the little crotch goblins to the military elite. On that note, each pair of royals would then be evacuated from London at great speed, driven in separate motorcades escorted by military police motorbikes. The motorcades would drive north to one of 3 safe houses selected to protect the lives of the Windsors: Maddisfield Court in Worcestershire, Pitchford Hall in Shropshire, and Newby Hall in North Yorkshire. Now, as you might have gathered from the fact that each of those places have formal names, and that include things like court and hall in them, all 3 locations were not exactly an anonymous home you would normally associate with the concept of a safe house. And yes, every one of them is a proper mansion, but listen, downgrading from palace to mansion was probably very traumatic for the royals already. Don't judge until you've walked a mile in their shoes. These locations also had the benefit of being rather isolated and plenty of room to accommodate bodyguards and other service personnel, because my god, cooking for yourself, gross. I almost just threw up in my mouth just thinking about it. In addition, they could be conveniently fitted with some lovely features such as slit trenches, barbed wire entanglements, and machine gun nests. The plan did not stop there, however. Should the invaders progress as far as the Midlands, the priority of the Coates mission team was to save the heir to the throne, Elizabeth, and her sister, Margaret. The princesses would be driven to Liverpool and then evacuated to Canada, more precisely to Hatley Castle, Colwood, British Columbia. However, in reality, the Axis powers never had the aerial nor naval power required to pull off Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain. This became evident in 1942, and thus the Coates mission was disbanded and the long-suffering monarchs didn't have to suffer more by being evacuated to mansions, nor even worse to a gorgeous castle in beautiful British Columbia. It was touch and go there for a little bit though. Moving on from there, alternate history enthusiasts might have a ball picturing the exiled Princess Lilibet and Margot leading the anti-Axis resistance from Canada. But in reality, the future Queen Elizabeth II and her sister Margaret were far too young to have an active role on the home front. Thus, as to what the pair got up to during the war, the young royals spoke at the BBC's Children's Hour, addressing all the mini plebeians across the Commonwealth, and especially those who had been forced to evacuate due to the war. They stated, "We know every one of us that in the end all will be well, for God will care for us and give us victory and peace," curiously leaving out that God would also give some of us, mainly them, palaces, backup mansions, and servants filling both as well. At the age of 14, the future queen also did her part by appearing in propaganda material for the Dig for Victory campaign, which encouraged British households to grow their own food. On April the 21st, 1944, Lilibet turned 18 and started nagging her dear old dad, asking to be more involved in the war effort. Eventually, in March of 1945, George allowed her to join the women's branch of the Army, the Auxiliary Territorial Service, or ATS. The war was almost over at this point, so all relatively safe for her to do so, but the princess still had enough time to become a trained driver and mechanic, learning how to service, maintain, and repair several military vehicles. Lilibet was given the honorary rank of second subaltern, equivalent to that of a second lieutenant. As such, she could aspire to a daily wage of 11 shillings 8 pence, which is roughly 33 pounds in 2025 money. Besides fixing axles on Humber four-wheel drive vehicles, Lilibet was also busy exchanging letters with a strapping young Greek naval officer serving with the Royal Navy. This would be her future husband Philip, later the Duke of Edinburgh. While not a member of the royal family at the time of the conflict, Philip would join the Windsors by marriage in November of 1947, and his naval career during the war is sufficiently cool to warrant his inclusion in today's video as the only member of this group who actually did some real butt-kicking during the war, including at one point very cleverly saving the ship he was on from being blown up by the Germans. Philip of Mountbatten was born Prince Philip, the son of Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark and Princess Alice of Battenberg. Following the Greek defeat in the Greco-Turkish War and the ensuing revolution of September of 1922, Andrew, Alice, and their 5 children were forced into exile. Philip, the youngest, was aged only 1 at the time. In the years that followed, Philip's 4 older sisters all married German aristocrats, 3 of whom were members of the Nazi Party. Young Philip studied 2 years in Germany before finishing his secondary school in Britain under the tutelage of his maternal uncle Louis Mountbatten. In September of 1938, having just turned 17, Philip enrolled in the Royal Naval College of Dartmouth, graduating in 1939 and also bagging the Eardley Howard Crockett Prize for Best Cadet of the Year. He then joined the Royal Navy with the rank of midshipman in January of 1940 when World War II had already started. At the time, the young officer was yet to acquire citizenship in Britain, but being a Greek national, he was classified as a neutral foreigner, which meant that he could indeed serve for His Majesty's Navy, but not in a combat zone. However, Uncle Louis stepped in, ensuring that Philip received a commission aboard the battleship HMS Ramillies in February of 1940. And anyway, in October of that year, Italy invaded Greece, meaning that Greek nationals were no longer neutral. By February of 1941, Philip had been promoted to sub-lieutenant, serving on the battleship HMS Valiant, part of the Royal Navy's Mediterranean Fleet. This new posting would give him the chance to directly get back at the invaders of his homeland, Fascist Italy. From March the 27th to March the 29th, the Valiant was part of the fleet which soundly defeated the Italian Navy at the Battle of Cape Matapan, southern Greece. The battle's main actions were fought at night, and Philip was in charge of the Valiant's port searchlight. While at his battle station, the future Duke of Edinburgh reportedly spotted a target in sight, after which he was ordered to open the shutters of his searchlight. He states of this, "At this point, all hell broke loose as all our 15-inch guns started firing at the stationary cruiser, which disappeared in an explosion and a cloud of smoke. I was then ordered to train left and lit up another Italian cruiser, which was given the same treatment. By this time, the night was full of smoke, loud bangs, and flashes. That bit of the Mediterranean then became a very dangerous place." Philip's handling of the searchlight earned him a mention in dispatches from his commanding officer, who wrote that the successful and continuous illumination of the enemy greatly contributed to the devastating results. 1 year later, October of 1942, Philip had been promoted to first lieutenant and was serving on the destroyer HMS Wallace, escorting convoys of supplies from North America. In July of 1943, the Wallace was redeployed to the Mediterranean in support of Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily. During a nighttime action, HMS Wallace was targeted by several German planes whose initially imprecise bomb drops were getting closer and closer and closer, with not a whole lot they could do about it. But before the umpteenth bomber could finally send the Wallace to the bottom, the 21-year-old Philip proposed a brilliant plan to his captain, as recounted 60 years later to the BBC by veteran Heir. The next thing, a wooden raft was being put together on deck. Within 5 minutes, they launched a raft over the side. At each end was fastened a smoke float. When it hit the water, the smoke floats were activated and billowing clouds of smoke interspersed with small bursts of flame gave a convincing imitation of flaming debris on the water. Philip's idea had been, thus, to deceive the German pilots into believing that their bombs had actually succeeded and all that was left of the Wallis was some floating, flaming debris. Remarkably, it worked, and the next German attacks concentrated their bombs on the smoking decoy instead. Hargreaves would go on, Prince Philip saved our lives that night. He was always very courageous and resourceful and thought very quickly. You would say to yourself, what the hell are we going to do now? And Philip would come up with something. The following year, Philip was transferred to the mildly humorously named destroyer, HMS Whelp, supporting yet another amphibious landing, Operation Dragoon, the Allied invasion of southern France, often overshadowed by its northern counterpart, Operation Overlord. Throughout the end of 1944 and the first half of 1945, Philip and the HMS Whelp saw action in the Indian Ocean, during which the Greek Royal personally conducted rescue operations, saving at least 4 downed airmen from drowning. Philip's final posting was with the 27th Destroyer Flotilla in the Pacific, which gave him the opportunity to witness Japan's formal surrender ceremony taking place aboard the battleship USS Missouri on the 2nd of September 1945. The future Prince Consort had thus served with distinction throughout most of World War II, firmly pledging his allegiance to the country which had effectively adopted him and opposing the Axis powers with unwavering conviction. The same cannot be said for the next royal in our overview, David, who was briefly King Edward VIII and later became the Duke of Windsor. Back in July of 1933, when David was still Prince of Wales, he had started expressing his sympathies towards Germany and its new Nazi-dominated government. In a letter to Prince Louis Ferdinand, the grandson of former German Kaiser Wilhelm II, he wrote, "It is no business of ours to interfere in Germany's internal affairs, either with Jews or with anything else. Dictators are very popular these days. We might want one in England before long." According to German historian Professor Karina Urbeck, University of London, in the 1930s, David had been entertaining the idea of an Anglo-German alliance. This idea had been concocted with his pal, Charles Edward, Duke of Coburg, a German grandson of Queen Victoria and a Nazi official. Shortly after David's accession to the throne as King Edward VIII, his sympathies were noted by the German ambassador to London, Leopold von Hosch. King Edward quite generally feels warm sympathy for Germany. I have become convinced during frequent, often quite lengthy talks with him that his sympathies are deep-rooted and strong enough to withstand the contrary influences to which they are not seldom exposed. According to Conservative Member of Parliament Henry Channon, Edward's feelings went beyond a warm sympathy. In December of 1936, Channon wrote in his diary, "The king is going the dictator way and is pro-German against Russia and against too much slipshod democracy. I shouldn't be surprised if he aimed at making himself a mild dictator, a difficult enough task for an English king." On the German side, Albert Speer claimed Hitler himself said, "I am certain through him permanent friendly relations could have been achieved. If he had stayed, everything would have been different. His abdication was a severe loss for us." That said, on the one-time king's side, he would later simply claim that he felt Germany would make a great ally against what he saw as the real threat the nation was facing at the time, communism in Russia and its potential spread. As he would later outline in 1966, recollecting back when he met with Hitler after abdicating his throne, "Hitler made me realize that Russia was the only enemy and that Great Britain and all of Europe had an interest in encouraging Germany to march against the East and to crush communism once and for all. I thought that we ourselves would be able to watch as the Nazis and the Reds would fight each other." His equerry, Dudley Forwood, would likewise write in his memoirs of the former king, present Duke, "Whereas the Duke, Duchess, and I had no idea that the Germans were or would be committing mass murder on the Jews, we were none of us averse to Hitler politically. We felt that the Nazi regime was a more appropriate government than the Weimar Republic, which had been extremely socialist." So rewinding back to his abdication of the throne, after having tossed aside his crown, the now styled Duke of Windsor and his new wife were given an invite to come tour German factories by the German Labor Front. Given the political climate at the time and that he was supposed to be keeping a low profile, as you can imagine, he was strongly advised not to go. However, much as he often did, he decided to do whatever he wanted anyway, often in this case suggested to be partially because Germany had extended the invitation very respectfully, right down to, upon arrival, referring to his wife as Her Royal Highness, an honorific the Duke was still sore his own brother had explicitly refused her. Having himself likewise been shunned from state functions on the home front, it's thought he also was interested in taking his new wife on such a stately tour, with originally the plan not just to tour Germany, but there was also a formal trip to the United States planned at this point as well. And so it was that in the summer of 1937, the Duke and Duchess very controversially traveled to Germany, where they toured factories and met with the likes of Göring, Himmler, Goebbels, and even Chief Silly Mustache himself. German interpreter Paul Schmidt would claim of Hitler and the Duke's meeting, Hitler was evidently making an effort to be as amicable as possible towards the Duke, whom he regarded as Germany's friend, having especially in mind a speech the Duke had made some years before, extending the hand of friendship to Germany's ex-servicemen's associations. In these conversations, there was, so far as I could see, nothing whatever to indicate whether the Duke of Windsor really sympathized with the ideology and practices of the Third Reich, as Hitler seemed to assume he did. Apart from some appreciative words for the measures taken in Germany in the field of social welfare, the Duke did not discuss political questions. But going back to the Duke's assistant, Forwood claims that after the conversation with Hitler, the Duke apparently was under the impression that Hitler was leaning towards pacifism, although noteworthy, this does not seem to jive with what the Duke himself would allege with regards to Hitler apparently being very open about his desire to take down communism in Russia. For whatever it's worth, Forwood would also claim that during his interactions with Hitler, Schmidt was seemingly intentionally mistranslating Hitler and the Duke's conversations at points, perhaps to smooth out the conversations between the two and any political differences they may or may not have had. That said, Forwood would also state, "My master said to Hitler, the Germans and the British races are one. They should always be one. They are of Hun origin." On that note, the Duke was notably very, let's just say, overtly racist. For example, upon visiting Australia in 1920, writing of the native Australian people, "They are the most revolting form of living creature I've ever seen. They are the lowest known form of human beings and are the nearest thing to monkeys," among other similar remarks about various other groups. As for the Duke's opinion of Hitler, he would later claim in his memoirs that while he had great respect for the Germans, as for the former homeless artist himself, his impression after meeting Hitler was, "The Führer struck me as a somewhat ridiculous figure with his theatrical posturing and his bombastic pretensions." While the Duke had been riding something of a surge of popularity within the US for marrying an American, naturally, after the extremely controversial touring of Germany and seemingly butting up to the Nazis, the former plan to go do a similar visit to look over factories and labor practices in the United States had to be canceled owing to the backlash that resulted in America. The Duke did not exactly do himself any favors in some circles after in Britain or America either when, in May of 1939, he gave a speech delivered from Verdun, France, calling for appeasement, though this seemingly less to do with wanting an alliance with Hitler per se at this point, and more to do with trying to avoid, as he called it, the unending scenes of horror of war he personally witnessed during World War I, as well as his aforementioned thought that if they simply leave Hitler be, he'd take care of communism for everyone else. To quote the Duke, "I thought the rest of us could be fence sitters while the Nazis and the Reds slogged it out." But going back to his 1939 speech, he stated, "I am deeply conscious of the presence of the great company of the dead, and I am convinced that could they make their voices heard, they would be with me and what I am about to say. I speak simply as a soldier of the last war, whose most earnest prayer it is that such cruel and destructive madness shall never again overtake mankind. There is no land whose people want war." The BBC received a recording of the speech and promptly filed it away, labeling it with "important, not to be broadcast." That said, millions elsewhere had heard it, and a transcript found its way back to Britain and was published in various newspapers in the country. From all this, a fascinating, if slightly nightmarish on some points, alternate history timeline is one where David chose not to marry Miss Simpson and instead remained king. Given both Hitler's obvious desire to buddy up to him and the king's inclination to keep Britain out of any such conflict with Nazi Germany, or even support them against the Russians, it's interesting to think how wildly history may have been different and how it all potentially turned on one man's love of his woman. Could Hitler have successfully overthrown Russia if he'd not had Britain to fight as well? And if Britain stayed neutral in the war, would the United States ever have joined the war efforts against Germany, or simply focused on Japan after Pearl Harbor? Noteworthy on that one, as we've covered before in our video on why did the Japanese join Nazi Germany during World War II, given Nazi ideology, the countries were not actually really allies in a practical sense. And indeed, Even after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, most of the early efforts the US put forth were not against Japan, but directed at Germany, simply using Pearl Harbor as an excuse to push the country to join the war in Europe, even though Germany had had nothing to do with the attack. And again, Japan and Germany were allies mostly only in name, and leadership knew it. Indeed, Hitler was not even under any obligation to declare war on the United States when the US declared war on Japan. Whatever the case there, as for real history, at the start of World War II, the Duke was appointed Major General and assigned to the British military mission in France. However, he apparently was highly unsatisfied with such a position and in general despised the government of Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain. This fact was not lost on one Count Julius von Zech, German ambassador in the Netherlands. On January 27, 1940, Zech wrote about the Duke to Ernst von Weizsäcker, second in command to Germany's foreign minister Joachim von Ribbentrop. According to Zech, I might have the opportunity to establish certain lines leading to the Duke of Windsor. He has expressed himself in especially uncomplimentary terms about Chamberlain, who he particularly dislikes and who, as he thinks, is responsible for his being frozen out. Also, there seems to be something like the beginning of a fronde forming around Windsor, which for the moment of course still has nothing to say, but which at some time under favorable circumstances might acquire a certain significance. Now to clarify, Zech used the French term fronde, indicating a movement of protest, even rebellion against established leadership. Zech went on to explain how one of his intermediaries had made contact with the Duke while in London. I had explained to him through an intermediary why it is completely utopian for England to attempt to effect a change of regime in Germany, and the statements of my intermediary are believed to have made a certain impression on him, more in any case than those pitched in the contrary tone which he got at the same time from the group around Chamberlain. On February 19th, Zech sent a second letter to Weizsäcker. The Duke of Windsor has said that the Allied War Council devoted an exhaustive discussion at its last meeting to the situation that would arise if Germany invaded Belgium. Reference was made throughout to a German invasion plan said to have been found in an airplane that made a forced landing in Belgium. On the military side, it was held that the best plan would be to make the main resistance effort in the line behind the Belgian-French border, even at the risk that Belgium should be occupied by us. On March 2nd, 1940, Weizsäcker replied to Zech, I submitted both letters to the foreign minister. He even showed the second one to the Führer. If you can, without inconvenience, obtain further information of this nature, I should be grateful if you would pass it on to me. There is no publicly available evidence on whether Zech wrote further dispatches to Berlin regarding the Duke of Windsor. Based on the February dispatch alone, though, one might argue that it would prove how the Duke, a major general in the British Army, was in contact with an enemy official and had shared topics discussed by the Allied War Council. A counter-argument, however, would be that Zech simply wrote that the Duke of Windsor has said the Duke and not the Duke of Windsor has said to me. And if it were the former, how did he hear of this? Just a rumor and hearsay which may not have even happened or not so clearly as Zech stated? Fortunately, nobody knows the answer to any of this today. It is possible that the Duke may have discussed the Allied War Council meeting with an unknown party, perhaps the intermediary mentioned in the January dispatch, without knowing that the individual was actually a German agent, as spies were everywhere on both sides, even occasionally in prominent positions. And it is noteworthy that the Duke had a long-standing propensity to not really care about formalities, traditions, and in this case perhaps a little lax on secrecy and security, and in all, generally happy to give his thoughts on things, so presumably it was probably more the he talked to someone he shouldn't have, who may or may not have talked to someone else, and it all got back to Zech, assuming any of this happened at all. Stepping away from speculation, what we do know is that Germany's invasion of various surrounding nations was a smashing success, and realistically, such a success did not depend on intelligence willfully provided or carelessly revealed by the Duke. Rather, it should be credited to the plans concocted by Generals von Manstein and Guderian, which called for an armored push through the poorly defended Ardennes sector. Critically, the early incarnation of the plan was drafted in late 1939 and approved by Hitler on February 17, 1940. Therefore, by the time Zech's dispatches had actually been considered by his superiors in early March, the German army had already firmed up their plans, and the Duke's remarks would have made zero difference to anything. With Germany overrunning parts of France, while you might think the Duke and Duchess would head back to safety in Britain, they were still not welcome there. Thus, they first relocated to southern France before crossing the border to Spain. The Windsors then spent some time in Madrid before moving again to Portugal. In both locations, they came into contact with Axis diplomacy and intelligence services while continuing to oppose Britain's participation in the war. Thomas Inskip, Lord Chief Justice of England, warned Winston Churchill that the Duke is well known to be pro-Nazi and he may become the center of intrigue. But just what type of intrigue? According to Professor Urbeck from the University of London, during their stay in Madrid, the Windsors met with their friend Javier Bermejillo, a Spanish diplomat. In a report to his superiors, Bermejillo wrote that the Duke had blamed the outbreak of the war on the Jews, the Reds, and the Foreign Office. Following another encounter taking place on June the 25th, the Spanish diplomat reported the Duke's conviction that if England was bombed, peace would follow. Bermejillo claimed that Edward hoped very much for this to happen, as he wants peace at any price. The diplomat's report landed on the desk of Spanish dictator Francisco Franco and then passed on to the Germans. As noted by Professor Urbeck, the bombing of Britain started on the 10th of July, which seems to imply that the German Air Force undertook their bombing campaigns almost as if inspired by the Duke of Windsor's words. But here again, while it's entirely possible the Duke really did express these sentiments, as he very openly did want peace for Britain to spare his former people the horror of war, the commonly touted conspiracy that he was actively in support of Germany, or that his words, assuming he really did say them at all, about bombing Britain likely having the effect of pushing the nation to peace, don't really hold up under scrutiny. We should point out that the Luftwaffe did indeed drop 170 bombs on terrestrial targets in South Wales, East Anglia, Southeast and Southwest England from 6:15 a.m. on July the 10th until 2:14 a.m. on July the 11th. This attack, however, was part of what was later called the Battle of Britain, an operation conducted by the Luftwaffe to seize air superiority over the Channel in preparation for Operation Sea Lion, the already planned seaborne invasion of Britain. As the German Air Force lost the duel against the Royal Air Force, as noted, they shifted their focus onto the intensive bombing of military and civilian targets. This campaign, known as the Blitz, started on September the 7th, 1940. The general idea of the conspiracy here, however, is often further put forth owing to the next part of this tale, that the Duke would allegedly bring up the bombing of Britain again after moving to Lisbon, as well as potentially see about gaining German support for his return to Britain. According to police reports uncovered by journalist Paulo Ananciaso, once in Lisbon, the Windsors met with one Ricardo Espirito Santo, a banker with close ties to Nazi Germany. Author Andrew Lowney confirms such ties, stating that British intelligence reports claimed Espirito Santo dealt in stolen goods and that he, in effect, acted as banker to the Nazis. Moreover, the banker was also an informant to the German ambassador in Lisbon, for whom he wrote reports on the Duke of Windsor. What does seem clear is that from their side, the Nazi government was indeed extremely interested in finding an understanding with the Duke and Duchess. German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop wrote to his ambassador, "Germany is determined to force England to peace by every means of power, and upon this happening, would be prepared to accommodate any desire expressed by the Duke, especially with a view to the assumption of the English throne by the Duke and Duchess," which indicates that Ribbentrop considered the Windsor as potential puppet monarchs to install on the British throne in case of an Axis victory. Allegedly, German diplomats did discuss such an eventuality with the Duke and Duchess and reported back to Berlin via telegram. However, one such message noted how the Windsors rejected the idea of sitting on the throne, claiming, they replied that according to British Constitution, this was not possible after abdication. As the conspiracy goes anyway, they were allegedly open to reconsider the proposition should the war go in Germany's way. When an agent then remarked the course of the war may produce changes even in the British Constitution, the Duchess, in particular, became very thoughtful. Now, whether that actually happened or not, or what her being thoughtful implied, is not clear. According to Professor Urbeck, at this time the Soviet intelligence services also were keeping an eye on the comings and goings of the Windsor home. Soviet spies even allegedly reported back to Moscow that David was conducting negotiations with Hitler to agree on a peace deal and sign a military alliance against the USSR. Of course, evidence that any of that was actually happening does not appear to exist either, other than that the Duke really did want Britain to make peace with the Axis, though all indications, once again, simply being because he wanted Britain and its people protected by getting out of the war, with there not seeming to be any hard evidence at all at any point he had any inclination to try to regain his throne. And indeed on that one, shortly after the war, when the king was facing a potentially life-threatening surgery, it was suggested by some in power that the Duke return to England and start trying to endear himself to the masses in various ways, with the hope that he'd be made king again if King George VI died, rather than the king's young daughter ascending the throne. The Duke, however, noteworthy, chose not to accept this advice and remain where he was in quasi-exile. But going back to the war and all the rumors, as well as just the potential danger the Duke and Duchess were in, given they were not welcome in Britain, Winston Churchill was not going to run any risks, and so he found a brilliant solution to get David out of Europe. Give the man a promotion. The Duke would be appointed governor of the Bahamas so that he and Wallace could reside in the Caribbean islands until the end of the war. According to American historian David Kahn, Ribbentrop, on the other hand, was desperate to keep David in Europe, and so he dispatched to Portugal Walter Schellenberg, one of the top-ranking agents of the SD, the security office within the SS. And so it was that Schellenberg concocted Operation Willie, which bore no relation to a covert plan of the same name my college girlfriend executed with her ex, instead involving inviting the Windsors to a hunting outing near the border with Spain. Once there, a squad of operatives would burst through the border to kidnap the couple and bring them back to Germany. Which, we're just saying, if the Germans were having to resort to kidnapping, Gall is skeptical that the Duke and Duchess were in cahoots with them, especially as the couple refused the invitation, which sent Schellenberg into a spin. The German agent allegedly then scrambled to delay the Windsors' departure to the Bahamas by any means necessary. For example, he convinced the Portuguese police that someone had planted a bomb on the ship sailing out to the Bahamas. He even allegedly bribed David's chauffeur, instructing him to refuse to go to the Caribbean, though we're not sure how he thought that would stop the trip, unless he assumed David, being a royal, couldn't drive a car, or simply hire another driver, or a myriad of other ways to get around the problem. Again, color us skeptical on some of the specifics here. Either way, eventually the couple followed Churchill's instructions and took up their new jobs in Nassau at a safe distance from the grasp of German intelligence, though it wasn't a post he seemingly enjoyed that much, despite literally getting to chill in a tropical paradise while the world was warring away back in Europe and the Pacific. But to each their own. He states he felt the islands were a third-class British colony. As to an explanation of the appointment to nearby United States, Churchill would write to President Roosevelt in July of 1940, "The position of the Duke of Windsor in recent months has been causing His Majesty and His Majesty's government some embarrassment. As though his loyalties are unimpeachable, there is always a backwash of Nazi intrigue which seeks to make trouble about him now that the greater part of the continent is in enemy hands. There are personal and family difficulties about his return to this country. In all the circumstances, it was felt that an appointment abroad might appeal to him, and the Prime Minister has, with His Majesty's cordial approval, offered him the governorship of the Bahamas. His Royal Highness has intimated that he will accept the appointment." On Roosevelt's side, he was aware of all the intrigue surrounding the Duke, and during one visit of the Duke and Duchess to Palm Beach, Florida, he had J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI launch a full investigation on the couple, with the report, now declassified, seeing the FBI's opinion that the Duke was a Nazi sympathizer and may well become King of England once again if Hitler managed to conquer Britain. Of course, whether there was any truth to that is not really clear, and it may well be that the FBI was simply documenting all the other rumors that had been swirling about the exiled Duke, mostly instigated by the Nazis themselves, who really did seem to want to make that happen. In any event, the details of Operation Willie, again the German one, not my college girlfriend and her ex, as well as David's dangerous liaisons with Ribbentrop's men, only fully emerged in 1957 with the publication of the so-called Windsor Files, a subset of top-secret records known as the Marburg Files. That said, although these files were published in 1957, both the British and American governments had been aware of them for years. In fact, in 1953, Prime Minister Winston Churchill wrote to President Eisenhower asking his State Department not to include the telegrams in their official history of World War II. Eisenhower agreed, replying to Churchill that intelligence officials believed the telegrams to be a Nazi fabrication, to quote, concocted with some idea of promoting German propaganda and weakening Western resistance. When the files were eventually released to the public in 1957, the Duke of Windsor dismissed their contents as complete fabrications. The publication also elicited a response from the Crown in the form of a statement issued by Her Majesty's Stationery Office. The Duke was subjected to heavy pressure from many quarters to stay in Europe, where the Germans hoped that he would exert influence against the policy of His Majesty's government. His Royal Highness never wavered in his loyalty to the British cause. The German records are necessarily a much tainted source. The only firm evidence which they provide is of what the Germans were trying to do in that matter, and of how completely they failed to do it. The Duke, the royal family, and even some historians also dismissed the authenticity of the Czech dispatches we quoted earlier, claiming they were just similar Nazi propaganda. So what's the truth about the Duke of Windsor? Was he an active traitor, revealing Allied plans to Germany and even calling for his own motherland to be bombed? The actual evidence available, as we've been alluding to, seems to be not so much. Again, the Duke was not shy about wanting Britain to first stay out of the war and later to make peace with the Axis, but that was seemingly again and again and again simply about trying to protect Britain and its people from a conflict he seemed to feel they had no business getting involved in, rather than making any move to retake his throne or the like. This was a general stance many others, including the majority of Americans before Pearl Harbor, also held. And while he, like many of the era on both sides, seems to have been a rather raging racist, we're just guessing he, again like so many others the world over, quickly began to rethink some things after the full details of the Holocaust were revealed. Although we should note that contrary to popular belief, the world was very well aware of what Hitler and the Nazis were up to on that front even before they began liberating concentration camps. And indeed, Hitler first tried to simply get rid of the Jews by forcing them out, but when most nations very explicitly said, "No thanks, we won't accept them," and refused to let many Jews immigrate, Hitler went to Plan B. And most shockingly of all, even when that happened and the world's nations became fully aware of what was happening, they still, on the whole, continued to refuse to let Jews immigrate out of German-held lands, including Britain saying no thanks, with some exceptions for children, but not their parents. However, hearing stories about it and actually seeing video and pictures of the atrocities in the aftermath of the war apparently were two very different things, and the latter finally woke the world up and began changing an awful lot of opinions on so many things. We have a whole almost hour-long video on all of this. See, what did the German public know about the Holocaust during World War II? But so summing up the Duke, seemingly super racist like most of the rest of the world at the time, but otherwise not seemingly a Nazi collaborator, though maybe for a time during the war a Nazi sympathizer. This is a bit unclear, and certainly in the aftermath, both the Duke and Duchess and the British government would have had reason to want to whitewash his image there a bit wherever possible. But so that's 2 out of the 4 Dukes. Let's crack on with the next one, Henry, Duke of Gloucester, younger brother to the king, and then we'll get on to the second major conspiracy with the royals during the war. During his pre-war service with the 10th Royal Hussars Regiment, this Duke earned a reputation as an excellent horse rider and marksman. At the outbreak of World War II, the 39-year-old Field Marshal was posted to France, acting as chief liaison officer between the British Expeditionary Forces and the French Army. As such, Henry spent most of his time in headquarters meetings or visiting troops to boost their morale, but he still had some close brushes with death, both occurring in May of 1940. After the German army had invaded Belgium, Henry wished to visit its king, Leopold II, an old childhood friend. On May 14th, the Duke set out from his hotel at Arras, northern France, driving towards the Belgian border. That very night, the hotel was destroyed in an air raid which caused several casualties. After meeting his pal Leo, Henry drove back to France but was caught by yet another bombing. The Duke was able to jump out of his car and dive to safety, but his vehicle was almost destroyed and he suffered a rather severe wound. The British HQ in France was dead embarrassed about the whole incident, as they had not been able to ensure the safety of the man who was the de facto second in line to the throne. And before you nitpick, we know that Princess Elizabeth would have been formally the second in line, but Uncle Henry would have reigned as regent until she reached the age of 21. And as there was a war on, such a position would have been extremely prominent during that period. In any case, in June, Henry was recalled to Britain and to safety, but in early 1942, he left again on a long mission across the Middle East, East Africa, and India. The trip was not without risk, as some geographies were still under threat from Axis advance. Following another catastrophic incident which raised security concerns for the entire royal family, the Duke of Gloucester was returned to Britain and kept out of danger for good. He would leave his motherland again only in November of 1944, following his appointment as Governor General of Australia. Even so, Henry was never far from danger. The ship he traveled on was at one point chased by a U-boat, but the escort vessel successfully defended him and his family. But what was that catastrophic incident we mentioned earlier? This was a plane crash which actually did not involve Henry, but another brother of King George VI, the Duke of Kent. A plane crash in which the Duke of Kent had lost his life, and one which some claim was not accidental. The fourth son of the previous King George V was also called George because, once again, the royal family was not just advocates of incest, but also giving everyone the same names. As this is our third George of this story, to avoid confusion, I'm going to refer to him as the Duke of Kent, or simply Kent, because I'm an adult and nobody can stop me. So Kent was an accomplished pilot and had attained the rank of group captain in the RAF in 1937 at age 35. In September of 1939, he was briefly posted to the Royal Navy before returning to the RAF's training command in April of 1940. By that time, partially because nepotism, he had risen to the rank of Air Vice Marshal, but also asked to be demoted again to group captain so that he would not appear more senior than other, more experienced commanders. In July of 1941, the Duke was nonetheless promoted again to the rank of Air Commodore within the staff of the Inspector General. In practice, his duty was to visit RAF bases to boost the morale of the airmen. This all brings us to 1:10 p.m. on August 25, 1942, when the Duke of Kent and 14 personnel took off from Invergordon on the east coast of Scotland, heading to Iceland, officially on non-operational duty, though, they were definitely going for a purpose, even if not publicly disclosed even today for reasons we'll get to shortly. Their craft was an S-25 Sunderland Mark III flying boat, and the crew had standing orders to fly over water for added safety. Lead pilot, Flight Lieutenant Frank Goyen, and his 4 navigators initially did just that, following the coastline towards Duncansby Head, the northernmost tip of Scotland. Weather conditions over the coast were mostly good, but inexplicably, the Sunderland flying boat veered inland and descended to 650 feet of altitude, eventually crashing against Eccles Rock, a hill near the village of Dunbeath. The craft carried more than 11,000 liters of fuel, which subsequently exploded, killing the Duke of Kent and 13 of his companions. Now, if you're good at math, you just noticed that 13 does not equal 14, and there was indeed one survivor, tail gunner Andy Jack, who once again proved, as we've covered before on our video, What's the Safest Seat on an Airplane, the back is where you want to be, with some nuance which we get into in that super interesting video. The airman had only minor wounds as he exited the wreckage. As per protocol, he should have stayed put and waited for rescue, but instead he ran towards an isolated cottage asking for help, as that makes a lot more logical sense. The owner of the cottage, one Elsie Sutherland, alerted authorities, and within 90 minutes of the crash, 2 policemen and 1 doctor arrived at the crash site. One of the police officers, Will Betham, released an interview in 1985, during which he mentioned a puzzling detail. He claimed that the lifeless Duke of Kent was handcuffed to a case which had burst open, scattering its contents, a large number of Swedish banknotes. However, on October 7, 1942, the Secretary of State for Heir, Archibald Sinclair, presented the findings of his inquiry about the crash to the House of Commons, making no such mention. Instead, he states, accident due to aircraft being on wrong track at too low altitude to clear rising ground on track. Captain of aircraft changed flight plan for reasons unknown and descended through cloud without making sure he was over water and crashed. The responsibility for this serious mistake in airmanship lies with the captain of the aircraft. Now, as any pilot knows, controlled flight into terrain is not exactly uncommon, and even more so when flying in clouds, and even triply more so back then when they didn't have fancy GPS to tell them exactly where they were, or digital terrain maps which will give you plenty of warning, etc. Further, the crash investigation revealed that the plane in question flew into the terrain at cruise power, which would seem to indicate they did, indeed, not realize they'd veered off course and were no longer over water, but over land and descending. All something quite easy to have happen as you're skirting the coast if not accurately accounting for crosswinds and the like, and have lost visual on anything because you're in a cloud. Really, nothing suspicious about any of this up to this point. Since then, however, the death of the Duke of Kent has been surrounded by a number of conspiracy theories, because what hasn't, honestly? But first of all, what was the exact nature of the supposed not a mission, but they were definitely going somewhere for some reason? Further, in 1946, the Ministry of Works commissioned a memorial cross to be erected near the crash site. It bears the inscription, "In memory of the Duke of Kent and his companions who lost their lives on active service during a flight to Iceland on a special mission on the 25th August 1942. So the plot thickens. Active service and a special mission. But just how special? The only other clue came in 2001 from Peter Brown, the nephew of George Saunders, one of the crash victims. According to Brown, in August of 1942, Saunders visited his parents and informed them that, "I'm going on a most important mission, very secret, I can't say any more." Which honestly, that seems rather redundant. By definition, any military mission would have been secret and the person couldn't say any more, and telling his parents he was going on a mission, I mean, yep, totally normal, but clearly a conspiracy here. Just shocking it took 6 centuries for this profound information to make its way to public ears. But either way, from then on, all we have is speculation and hypotheses, such as those compiled by authors Lynn Picknett, Clive Prince, and Stephen Pryor in their 2001 works Double Standard. According to the authors, the Duke of Kent was a proponent of appeasement and entertained friendly relations with Nazi Germany, much like his older brother, the Duke of Windsor. In fact, the Duke of Kent had met with Rudolf Hess and Nazi Alfred Rosenberg in 1935. The latter even wrote to Hitler that Kent was maneuvering to steer the British cabinet towards beginning the movement in the direction of Germany. Then, in late 1937, the British Foreign Office had noted how the Duke of Kent had become very close with Joachim von Ribbentrop, at the time German ambassador in London. It appears that the Duke had also been friendly with Austrian princess and Nazi spy Stephanie von Hohenlohe. According to the MI5, the princess appeared to be actively recruiting these British aristocrats in order to promote Nazi sympathies. Finally, according to the authors of Double Standards, in early 1939, the Duke of Kent met in secret with his German cousin, Prince Philip of Hesse, to discuss how to avoid a war. The authors also reference another famously puzzling flight, the unauthorized solo mission conducted on May 10, 1941 by Rudolf Hess. The designated successor of Adolf Hitler flew a fighter bomber to Scotland, hoping to meet with the Duke of Hamilton to discuss a separate peace with Britain. According to Picknett, Price, and Pryor, the Duke of Kent was at Hamilton's place on the night that Hess parachuted over Scotland. So what's going on here? The conspiracy theory, completely unsubstantiated by the way, goes that the Duke of Kent may have been in touch with Hess or other Nazi officials to negotiate a separate peace with Germany. The secret mission which had led to his death was about meeting Reich officials in neutral Sweden, hence the alleged presence of Swedish currency at the crash, and handcuffed to the Duke's wrist for reasons we guess. Listen, it makes a more compelling conspiracy if a briefcase full of cash was handcuffed to a prominent person's wrist instead of simply carrying a wallet or money bag, okay? I mean, just imagine if it wasn't handcuffed to his wrist. Any other people aboard the plane could have taken it and ran to a different part of the plane. Yet another conspiracy that's popped up very prominently is that he wasn't going to side with the Germans at all, but rather to the United States. This conspiracy is referencing his previous meetings with US leadership that he really did have. At this point, simply unhappy with the monarchy and their refusal to let him take a more active role in using his piloting skills in fighting Nazi Germany, he was allegedly going to secretly meet with US officials, again to try to defect, leaving his country behind with the hope of flying for the US in the war because sure, why not? Or maybe he really was going to meet with US officials and the alleged handcuffed briefcase did not contain money, but top secret documents he was assigned to personally escort. That at least would make more sense than handcuffing a briefcase of money to himself during or before the flight to make sure no one else could have any chance at seeing the documents in case any spies were members of the crew. Now, we actually just made this secret document to the US part up out of thin air. This is super easy when you don't have to adhere to any actual evidence. But going back to the supposed Nazi angle, not satisfied with secret alliance missions involving a briefcase full of cash, there is even a suggestion that the Sunderland carrying the Duke may have been sabotaged by the British Secret Service on Winston Churchill's orders to prevent such a meeting from taking place. That's right, government murder. Now it's getting good, I would totally watch this movie. However, such extraordinary claims would require extraordinary evidence, or actually any evidence at all to be taken seriously. But the necessary evidence is nowhere to be found. Literally, the documentation gathered by the Commission of Inquiry, including the flight plan, should have been declassified in 1990, but after that date, the Public Record Office reported that the dossier had gone missing, possibly while in transfer to the Royal Archives at Windsor Castle. Which may sound rather convenient, but does this mean that there was indeed a conspiracy at play to assassinate the Duke of Kent? While it's always possible there was some sort of potential secret negotiation meeting happening here that the government would not want disclosed today, it's also possible he was taking a pleasure cruise to Orgy Island and the government wouldn't want that revealed either. We could literally say anything we wanted here, from painting him as a villain to hero to a man who really just loved the feel of handcuffs on his wrist as his kink. we don't judge, but given zero evidence of literally anything, we find this type of random speculation unhelpful. It's one thing to try to Sherlock Holmes it based on real evidence. It's a whole other thing to say because a high-level leader met with other high-level leaders years before. Again, he did this with the US leadership too, and so did countless others on both sides because they were, leaders of nations, that somehow led to a conspiracy later on that is otherwise seemingly completely made up and based on no actual data anywhere. As for the whole government murder thing, this seems highly unlikely, not the least of which because there would have been vastly easier ways to accomplish that did not cost over a dozen other people their lives. It's also weird that, if true, the British government would react in wildly disparate ways to address two very similar situations. So back in June of 1940, the Duke of Windsor, a vastly bigger embarrassment to the country, is in favor of peace with Germany and is allegedly in contact with Nazi officials, or at least their intermediaries and acolytes, and not shy about his position on all of this. Further, the Nazis really did seem bent on trying to buddy up with him and possibly even restore him to his throne. And what is Churchill's reaction to this? He gives him a promotion and sends him to the Bahamas for his protection and to get him out of Europe. Then, in August of 1942, his younger brother, the Duke of Kent, is allegedly in a similar situation, but for some reason, Churchill goes and has him assassinated along with killing everyone else aboard, rather than just a similar move to his brother. Or, offing him in any number of easier ways. Again, we could go round and round and round making up any manner of things here, but there's no evidence, and the evidence we do have seems pretty cut and dry. The way the crash happened is shockingly common even today with all our fancy gear that otherwise should prevent such from ever happening, but controlled flight into terrain still happens regularly. For what it's worth, it's also been claimed that the Duke and the crew aboard tended to do things like flip coins and the like to decide who would fly versus other jobs on a given flight, and that many aboard were not qualified to fly in clouds. So if true, that would also explain a lot, but also, who knows if that's true, as with so much of this. But for real, try flying a plane in a cloud, you'll see. I would personally never willingly do so close to sea level and nearby land without our fancy schmancy technology like GPS, digital terrain maps, better alternate instrumentation, etc., no matter how good I think myself at more antiquated forms of aerial navigation and ability to trust my instruments, not my senses. And all because clouds can be a phenomenal way to get yourself killed, and there's a reason flying through such requires an entirely different and extensive form of training. Not to mention, even people vastly experienced and certified in such still occasionally find themselves no longer able to be alive for various reasons after doing it. The human brain does not know how to deal with that sort of visual sensory deprivation combined with being jostled about. You often will get vertigo, and beyond that, every sense you have will tell you that you are right in how you think you are oriented and the instruments are wrong. You, of course, can overcome elements of this by training to ignore your senses and as best you can potential vertigo and trust the instruments. But sometimes those instruments go wonky and are wrong as well. For instance, if your pitot tube ices up, which is super easy to have happen in a cloud or any other manner of things that can go wrong with instrument readings, which is why we have backup in independent instruments and you scan to try to confirm which one is right, all while probably feeling like you're upside down. Let alone that icing potential on the wings and control surfaces, let alone that even if you do everything else correctly, if you aren't navigating right, not difficult at all to fly right into a mountain, in some cases with it happening so fast, you probably don't even have a chance for your brain to register what just happened before you snuff it because you can't see anything while in a cloud but the cloud, and that is why so many people will fly into a mountain at cruise speed, never even realizing they're about to do it. Literally nothing about this accident seems suspicious, especially not in a 1942 plane with 1942 instrumentation, and even more so if they were stupid enough to let someone unqualified to do the flying while in a cloud do so. This also has sometimes been suggested as the reason for some level of cover-up. It simply made the Duke look like an unprofessional moron. In the end, the plane was flying along the coast, it flew into a cloud, it then got off course and slowly descended before piling into the earth at cruise speed because at no point did they realize they were descending and probably didn't even realize they were off course either. It's a super common story in general aviation even today. But you do you, conspiracy theorists. Pretty sure aliens could have been involved in the crash as well. You don't know. Come to think of it, Simon is a lizard person and resided in Britain at the time. I'll check with him on it and get back to you. But what about the secret mission part? They were going somewhere, and this one, it does seem plausible enough given the specific crew and plane and all of it that it was an actual mission, regardless of what the government would later say. Certainly, given the high profile of the crash, they likely also would not have wanted to tip off the Axis about any facet of the mission, or potentially even where they were really going. And on that note, being a mission during the wartime, it would be inherently secret without any need for any conspiracy. A mission's objectives being secret to many is just almost all such missions ever, and especially during wartime. Or maybe they were just on a pleasure flight to Island for reasons, who knows. Although based on everything I've researched about the males in the royal families of old, definitely putting my money on they were going to Orgy Island, which also explains the cash. Gotta tip the strippers. Moving on from there, it is true that an occasional questionable secret mission at the behest of the royals has been revealed over the years. For example, in March of 2024, British historian Mark Felton revealed how he had found documented evidence of a secret mission ordered by King George VI himself in June of 1945. The king had learned that Blankenberg Castle, previously within the British occupation zone of recently defeated Germany, was about to fall under the Soviet occupation zone following an adjustment of boundaries. So why did George care so much? Well, the castle belonged to the family of his German relative, the aforementioned Ernest Augustus, one-time Duke of Brunswick, among other titles. Worried that his relative's furniture and art collection would fall into Soviet hands, the king personally interfered in the British Army's chain of command to ensure that such treasure would be safely transferred to another Brunswick property, Marienburg Castle. Which may not sound like a big deal, but as Felton points out, the king essentially used the troops of the 1st Battalion Cheshire Regiment as removal men to accomplish a private mission in aid of citizens with ties to a government at war with Britain until the previous month. Perhaps not the best use of taxpayer funds in the military. In August 1945, King George was at it again, arranging yet another secret operation set in a German castle, this time the Friedrichshof. The monarch assembled a rather peculiar dynamic duo, Royal Librarian Owen Morsheed and MI5 officer Anthony Blunt. Their main objective was the recovery of some 4,000 letters sent by Queen Victoria to her daughter, also Victoria, wife of Kaiser Wilhelm II. But according to historian Miranda Carter, among others, the real objective of the expedition was to retrieve letters sent by the Duke of Windsor to Prince Philip of Hesse. Those letters sent during the war are alleged by some to have confirmed that the Duke had indeed revealed Allied strategies to the Germans, or otherwise simply contained elements that may have been embarrassing to the crown, which, based on researching all this and countless other videos on the British monarchy, can I just say it is not hard to embarrass the crown, you guys, and they take that crap extremely seriously owing to the whole second the public doesn't like them anymore in mass, they are probably out thing, and back then possibly even executed by revolutionaries. While Carter believes that Morshead and Blunt found no correspondence of that sort, Mark Felton believes otherwise. According to him, Morshead and Blunt did find potentially incriminating letters which were safely secreted to the royal archives. How do we know this? Don't know, but the twist is that Anthony Blunt had been a Soviet double agent since the mid-1930s, and he may have sent microfilm copies of the documents back to Moscow. Although, if he did so, it's weird that the Russians didn't leverage this to try to overthrow the monarchy via simply making it public and incite the masses against the family. The ramifications of Blunt's espionage actions go far beyond the scope of World War II and today's video, but suffice it to say, Blunt was in fact a member of the so-called Cambridge Five, a group of British double agents in cahoots with the Soviet intelligence active during the Cold War. Which launches us into a different topic which might tickle your fancy to finish this one off. During our research about the Coates mission, we delved into a similar escape plan to save good old Queen Elizabeth II and her family in case the Soviets nuked London, called Operation Candid, which ties in with other plans to ensure the British government would continue to function even after nuclear devastation by transferring some 4,000 civil servants into a secret bunker. Apparently, the planning team in charge even considered fitting the bunker's canteen with beer on tap. The proposal was rejected, but not because it was considered a bad idea to supply alcohol to thousands of traumatized and paranoid officials stuck underground while the world burned above their heads. Oh no, it was rejected to quote, the difficulties of arranging supplies of beer in a post-apocalyptic Britain, hinting that had they secured a reliable supply line, the bunker would have been flooded with booze. The whole thing sounds like the most British thing to ever British, and one we will very happily report about, but that's a story for another day.